Coming up on The World Today. Well, European nations announce new sanctions for Belarus because of its diverting a Ryanair flight carrying an opposition journalist in the country. Also, it's a remembrance for George Floyd, who died today 1 year ago in the United States. It's also Africa Day, as many Africans across the globe celebrate the day. Well, welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani here in Lagos. Many European nations, airlines, I should say, are avoiding routes leading to Belarus following the incident that happened over the weekend when a Ryanair flight was rerouted so opposition journalist Roman Protasevich could be arrested. Western countries accused Belarus of hijacking the plane carrying the journalist. And later yesterday, authorities released a video showing the journalist that appeared to have been recorded under duress. EU leaders met on Monday evening to discuss sanctions against Belarus for the hijack of the Ryanair flight and the arrest of the journalist. They also discussed banning Belarus airlines from their bloc's airspace. Leaders of the 27 member states also discussed calling on EU-based carriers to avoid flying over Belarus and to consider widening the list of Belarusian individuals that they already sanction, and call on the International Civil Aviation Organization to urgently investigate the Sunday incident. Countries have called for the release of 26-year-old Roman Protasevich, who is being detained in Belarus. Lithuanian authorities say 5 passengers never arrived, suggesting 3 others besides detainees Protasevich and Sofia Sepega, Roman's girlfriend, had disembarked in Minsk. The Belarusian authorities say the flight was diverted because of a bomb threat, which turned out to be a false alarm. Last night, EU leaders made a decision to impose more sanctions on Belarus, including economic ones, calling on airlines to avoid the former Soviet Republic's airspace and authorizing work to ban Belarusian airlines from European skies and airports.
This is an attack on freedom of expression, and this is an attack on European sovereignty. And this outrageous behavior needs a strong answer. Therefore, the European Council decided that there will be additional sanctions on individuals that are involved in the hijacking, but this time also on businesses and economic entities that are financing this regime. And Belarus used its control over its airspace in order to perpetrate a state hijacking. Therefore, the safety and security of flights through Belarus airspace can no longer be trusted, and the Council will adopt measures to ban overflights of the EU airspace and deny access to airports, to EU airports, to Belarus airplanes.
Supporters of the detained dissident journalists have demonstrated outside the European Union representation in Warsaw. An opposition Belarusian politician called for the country to be disconnected from the SWIFT system for cross-border payments. Belarus opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya says there is no doubt Protasevich is being tortured and called for tougher sanctions against the country.
But are behind bars.
A video of the detained journalist was posted online on Monday. It showed Protasevich saying he's in good health and acknowledging playing a role in organizing mass disturbances in Minsk last year. The comments were immediately dismissed by his allies as made under duress. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has faced the biggest challenge of his nearly 27-year rule, from protesters who took to the streets after he was declared winner of an election last year that they said was rigged. About 35,000 people have been detained since the start of regular demonstrations in August of 2020. Lukashenko denies electoral fraud and accused the West of sponsoring the protests. So we're still getting more on this. So we do have the VOA's Charles Main in Moscow. Charles, thank you for making time to speak to us today, and great to see you as always. Well, a lot has happened in the last 48 hours, and we're here with Belarus facing sanctions from the European Union. And I remember the Russian government accusing the EU and Western leaders yesterday of hypocrisy in their reaction to what the Belarusian authorities have done. What is the Kremlin's response now to the sanctions that have been imposed overnight by the EU?
Well, Russia is against sanctions in principle, mainly because Russia itself is under sanctions from the West, and their argument is it's not an effective tool to resolve problems. The Kremlin spokesman today said it was a rush to judgment on this incident, that there was still a lot to find out. He was critical of the EU for imposing both sanctions and, as we saw, this travel ban over flights over Belarusian airspace. Russia's argument on the surface of things, they say that the Belarusian dispatchers had simply done their job when the bomb threat emerged, that they'd done the correct thing by calling the plane down. Obviously, Western countries have said the credibility of those claims and the bomb threat is absurd. So we have this kind of split opinion, a split screen look at these events here.
Yeah, so Roman Potrasevich, the journalist in question, remains with Belarusian authorities. We don't exactly know where he's being kept, although some of his supporters do know. But we saw that video of him last night. His supporters say he made that under duress. It's not the first time we've seen authorities go after opposition leaders in Belarus. Tikhanovskaya, or one of them who spoke in the report that we played earlier, is one of those who luckily got away. Now, for a president who's ruled for nearly 30 years, how strong is his base, given all the opposition that he's been receiving over the last 1 year?
Well, I think it's important to remember the backstory here. So we saw these massive protests emerge because of flawed presidential elections last summer, ones that Ms. Tikhanovskaya, many think, actually won that race. But Mr. Lukashenko claimed a massive victory. And we've since seen him basically arrest or exile nearly every other leading member of the opposition. So obviously we saw, in fact, it was interesting to see Ms. Tikhanovskaya's spokesman say that he noted that she'd taken that same Ryanair flight to Vilnius before from Greece. So, this idea that anyone is safe, that seems to be one of the messages from this arrest. But going to your question about how loyal his base is, the Belarusian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, the important thing is he has, first of all, the support of the security services, at least for now. That's key. I think over the last year, we've seen him time and time again crack down on massive protests. If there was a moment where people thought perhaps the security services might turn towards the protesters, that did not happen. Maybe more importantly here, he also has the loyalty of the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin, who sees Lukashenko not so much as maybe a favorite partner, but an effective leader in the sense that he seems to think that anybody else who comes into power in Belarus would be more likely to turn towards Europe and out of Russia's orbit. So those two factors that seem to keep Mr. Lukashenko in power despite all the dissatisfaction at home.
So very quickly, Charles, what could happen to Potrasevich?
Well, he mentioned that he was feared for his life, and it's a legitimate fear. Technically, he faces terrorism charges that could land him in jail for 12 years. Belarus, however, is the only country that still executes prisoners in Europe. Mostly, it's also important to note here that opponents of the regime simply die in prison. We've seen this several times over the past year upon all these massive arrests, over 10,000 arrests. Just this week, we actually heard about a Belarusian political prisoner named Witold Ashurek. 49-year-old, seemingly healthy, died of cardiac arrest in authorities' custody. His body was released to his family with his head bandaged. The authorities say they dropped the body while unloading it from the refrigerator at the time. So obviously many murky circumstances there, and an example of just how much concern there is over Protasevich's safety.
Charles, thanks again for bringing us up to speed, and do stay safe in Moscow. On May 25th, 2020 was the day George Floyd, a 49-year-old African-American man, took his last breath under heavy pressure from a Minneapolis police officer who had his knee to his neck. His death sparked protests around the world calling for respect for Black lives. Derek Chauvin, the police officer who killed him, has been convicted of murder, but full justice apparently is yet to be served. A bill remains in the House of Representatives with U.S. lawmakers that would help reform the police and save lives. Today, however, people say they heard gunfire at the George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, where they gathered to remember George Floyd today. Some ran from the sounds, others sheltered in place, but there's been no indication that there was an injury or hurt, from this. On Sunday, we heard George Floyd's sister, Bridget Floyd, speaking to demonstrators about her brother. She said, "It's been a long year. It's been a painful year. It's been very frustrating for me and my family for our lives to change in the blink of an eye. I still don't know why." In other news, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been doing a ward round of the Middle East, meeting with Israeli leaders, discussing the future of the Middle East as the Israeli military and the Palestinian militants observe a ceasefire following days of fighting. Earlier today, he met with Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi, pledging U.S. support to rebuild Gaza and to re-engage with the Palestinians. He's due to meet Western-backed Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah later today. And back again in the United States, Texas legislators have passed a bill which would allow most people to carry concealed handguns without a permit. Current state rules require those carrying handguns to have a license, training, and background checks. Texas Republican-run Senate, however, has voted to drop all of these restrictions. A bill has been sent to Governor Greg Abbott, who said he will sign it into law, despite warnings from gun control groups that it could endanger the public. Now, Washington correspondent Maria Bird joins us now. She has more on this. Maria, thanks for joining us. But let's just begin with the latest, which is the bill this meant, the handgun carrying bill for Texas, Texas legislators, beg your pardon, have signed into law. How would this protect and provide some safety for or security for ordinary Americans who do not support the right to bear arms, given the spate of gun violence that have prevailed in the United States over the past few years?
Amarachi, you are correct. This is really putting, I think, a real challenge for those Americans that have been really seeking out a way to find security in the midst of so much turmoil here in the U.S. as it relates to gun violence. Many Americans are stating that they will definitely be extremely concerned when they are walking through the streets. We know that there are individuals that take their own powers and believe that they are oftentimes the police. We can see what happened to Arbery in Georgia when it was just a pedestrian that took his life, stating that he was doing the job of the police. And so this is going to be a real concern for the everyday Texan and those who are traveling to the state of Texas. But this is something that the governor, Abbott, is stating that he will support. As soon as it reaches his desk, he is going to sign it.
And this wipes away any legal restrictions, on people who are 21 and older to carry a handgun. How does this correspond, Maria, with the issue of background checks, which lawmakers, I believe Democrats in the House, Federal House, and in the Senate have been harping on, raising this as a means of preventing guns entering into the wrong hands, given some of the scenarios that you have already painted?
Yes, this is, this is going to be, I think, for lawmakers, it's going to set a precedent. This is going to begin something for states that believe in the right to bear arms, those states that have been challenged with many of the gun laws. We know this all began years ago with the Brady Law. And so we know that this is just going to kind of put forth, I think, for other states. They're giving them the ability to say, you know what, we're going to also put this forth, because licensing has been one of the key ways that lawmakers have been able to, and police officers, for those individuals that have guns and that commit crimes, have been able to identify these individuals, because oftentimes if they're using a licensed gun, they're able to trace that gun to an individual. So this puts an additional risk, and especially in the wake of what we've been seeing across the U.S. with mass shootings.
Maria, I guess we have to put a pin on this discussion because as soon as the governor signs this, it becomes free for all for everyone who's always wanted a gun in Texas. But thanks again for clearing some of these issues up with us, and do stay safe in Washington.
Thank you for having me.
Mali has been plunged back into another coup as the president and prime minister have been ousted by the officer who led last year's coup and who became vice president in the interim government. Colonel Assimi Goita says President Ba Ndor and Prime Minister Mokhtar Wayne failed in their duties and were seeking to sabotage the country's transition. They were arrested hours after a government reshuffle which saw 2 senior army officers replaced.
Just months after a military coup ousted the previous president, military officers in Mali detained the president, the prime minister, and defense minister of the interim government on Monday. President Ba Ndor, Prime Minister Mokhtar Ouane, and Defense Minister Selemane Doucouré were all taken to a military base in Kati outside the capital, Bamako. This comes just hours after 2 members of the military lost their positions in a government reshuffle. Vice President Colonel Assimi Goita confirmed that he removed the president and prime minister because they violated the terms of the transition by not consulting him on cabinet changes.
The interim vice president had no choice but to intervene in order to protect the transition and defend the republic, in order to push aside the president and his prime minister, as well as the people implicated in the situation. In this circumstance, the interim vice president invites the population to continue their activities and wants to reassure them of the commitment of the armed forces to preserve the higher interests of the Malian people in accordance with the transition chart. Furthermore, the interim vice president wants to indicate the transition process will continue as planned and that the planned elections will be held in 2022.
Last year, he led a coup against President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. He took up the post of vice president in the interim administration that is supposed to pave the way to a return to civilian rule. There are fears that their detentions could exacerbate instability in the West African country, where violent Islamist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State control large areas in the desert north. On Tuesday morning, the streets of Bamako were quiet. However, some people gathered to protest the detention of interim President Ba Ndor and Prime Minister Mokhtar Ouane, but were asked to stand down by a squad of police officers.
Alors, parce que déjà nous sommes dans un régime transitoire.
First, we're already in a transitional regime, and we're seeing a power grab by the military. Another immersion from the military in the political scene. As we already know the date for the next elections, we don't see the use of what is happening now. I put my support behind the Republic, the transition president, and the Prime Minister. I believe the military have better things to do elsewhere, rather than stay here and wreak havoc in the political game.
In the meantime, the United Nations mission in Mali called for the group's immediate and unconditional release and said those who hold the leaders will have to answer for their actions. The region's top decision-making body, ECOWAS, says the delegation will visit Bamako to help resolve the attempted coup. Kati's military base is notorious for ousting Mali's leaders. Last August, the military took President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta to the town of Kati and forced him to resign.
Well, there is good news on the continent. There is many Africans across the globe commemorate Africa Day today under the theme Arts and Culture, or Arts, Culture and Heritage. Levers for Building Africa We Want. South Africa, a nation with 11 official languages, also celebrating its diversity. While the Zulu and Xhosa tribes, historically referred to as nations, are the most dominant in South Africa, the Ndebele nation has recently been in the forefront fighting the recognition and preservation of its culture. Channel Television traveled to KwaNdebele and in Mpumalanga province of South Africa to find out how this nation is managing to preserve its culture of bright colors for centuries.
Ndebele people of South Africa are known as people of color, literally. What others call color blocking, referring to wearing of clothes with different colors at the same time, is what those from the Ndebele culture have done for centuries and are very proud of it. The Ndebele tribe, estimated to be numbering just over 1 million in South Africa, speak isiNdebele and dominate the Mpumalanga province on the eastern side of South Africa. 64-year-old Gogo Sophie Mahlangu is a musician and one of the oldest cultural custodians of the Ndebele people. She spends much of her time painting and beading at her workshop. She also teaches young girls in the community how to preserve their culture.
ngabona nhle ngomma umakata thanda ibhizinisi khulu athanda ukuthengisa afuna amabhuli ayenzela abantu amabhuli enzeni athengise enzeni nami into le yangena kancane.
Through the use of beads and paints, she colors everything she touches with her hands, from linen, furniture, clothing and ornaments, with a variety of colors to give all the material around her an Ndebele feel. 35-year-old Thando Mahlangu is an Ndebele culture activist. He has launched a national campaign to ensure the Ndebele culture is represented on national platforms, including television stations. He made headlines recently when he was humiliated at the Johannesburg shopping mall by the mall manager, who felt that the Ndebele attire he was wearing was exposing too much. However, Mahlangu says, as Africans commemorate Africa Day the world over, they must embrace and own who they are.
What I can say is, Africa, we need to celebrate being an African. You need to celebrate being a black person. You need to celebrate being yourself, you know.
His youthful partner, Ngobile Masuku, is also in this fight.
We must not leave our culture because it's where we belong. If you are a youth out there, you don't take your culture seriously, it might be a problem because sometimes if you don't know your culture, you don't know where you're from.
According to the historians, after their defeat by white settlers in 1883, the Ndebele people decided to use painting and beaded clothing as a way of silent resistance and preservation of their culture. Ndebele culture expert and researcher Tulani Gacha says the fight to preserve the Ndebele culture is a genuine one.
It's a community from the Creator himself. So the Creator himself, he presents himself through the work of Ndebele today. Looking at the art is the language of the Creator. It shows that Ndebele nation, they are cosmic people. They are from the Creator, and they have the special message to deliver in this current time.
And the colors of the Ndebele culture are being projected full spectrum globally by the people. A notable torchbearer is 85-year-old Madam Esther Mahlangu, a mural artist who has painted her people's colors boldly across the world. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Betty Dibia, Channels Television News.
Loving all the colors in that report. And as we go, Indiana Jones' fedora and Harry Potter's glasses are among over 1,200 film and television memorabilia items going under the hammer in June at the prop store in Santa Clarita in California. Matt Truex, marketing manager at the prop store, said the auction was the biggest they've had, and he expects keen interest from collectors. Among the hundreds of items, collectors will find memorabilia from films like Terminator 2, Judgment Day, Batman Elf, Top Gun, The Muppets, just to name a few. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.